Not every man is born with a heart prepared to love what he cannot understand. Samuel Turner watched the two emaciated chickens scratching in the dusty yard, their beaks pecking at grains invisible in the dry land that had once been prosperous. The tall, skeletal man who had brought them stood motionless beside the worn-out wagon, waiting for an answer Samuel did not want to give. The afternoon sun mercilessly punished the farm that had once been the pride of the Turner family, now reduced to loose boards, broken fences, and dreams buried under layers of red dust. The stranger had no name he wanted to share. He only pointed to the chickens, then to his daughter who sat in the back of the wagon like a forgotten burden. "Mary," he had murmured in the hoarse voice of someone who had swallowed too much sand. 20 years. Work hard. The words came out crooked from the toothless mouth, but Samuel understood the proposal with crystal clarity that hurt more than any punch in the stomach. 2 chickens for a wife. The most degrading business a man could do, but Samuel Turner was no longer the proud farmer of better times. Drought had taken the cattle, the creditors had taken the land, and loneliness had taken away their ability to dream of different days. She looked at Mary for the first time that afternoon and saw just one more problem to solve, one more mouth to feed when she could barely support her own. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands clasped in her lap, as if praying for a salvation that would not come. The shabby dress told stories of poverty that Samuel recognized well, and the brown hair tied in a tight braid revealed a thin neck marked by small scars that spoke of life too hard for someone so young. It was not beautiful in the sense that men used to desire, but there was something about her that disturbed Samuel in an unexpected way, a quiet dignity that contrasted with the sordid transaction that was taking place around him. Her father spat on the ground and made an impatient gesture. Samuel knew he had no real choice. Chickens meant eggs, and eggs meant the difference between surviving another week or giving up for good. He nodded without looking at Mary again, sealing a deal that would shame any man with a vestige of decency. The wedding took place on the same day, in the presence of the Justice of the Peace, who charged $2 for the service and did not ask unnecessary questions. Mary's father disappeared before the sun went down, leaving behind only the smell of sour sweat and the certainty that he had gotten rid of a burden. Samuel led his new wife into the house in silence, the two walking like strangers who would share only a roof and nothing else. Mary prepared dinner with the eggs of the very chickens that had sealed her fate. They ate without exchanging a word, the clatter of cutlery on the plate breaking a silence that seemed heavier than the still air of the night. Samuel watched her efficient movements in the kitchen, the way she cleaned each utensil with meticulous care, as if trying to erase any trace of her own presence. When it was time to sleep, he pointed to the small room at the back of the house. "You stay there," you said in a rougher voice that you intended. Mary just waved and disappeared behind the creaking wooden door. Samuel lay awake for hours, listening to the strange sounds of having someone else in the house, wondering what kind of man he had become. The first few days were spent in a mechanical survival routine. Mary woke up before the sun, brewed 2 strong coffee, fed the chickens and tended the small garden she tried to grow in the backyard. Samuel worked repairing the property, repairing what could be repaired and ignoring what was beyond salvation. They exchanged what was necessary, nothing more. She didn't complain. She didn't ask. She didn't question. It existed in the house as a useful shade that made his life easier without demanding recognition. But Samuel began to notice little things, the way she hummed softly as she worked, sad melodies that matched the dry wind that ran through the loose planks of the house, how she separated the best pieces of food for him without him noticing, the delicacy with which she treated the animals, talking to the chickens as if they were old friends who understood her words. One night, he woke up to the sound of muffled crying coming from her room. It was not a dramatic sob, but the suppressed tears of someone who had learned to suffer in silence. Samuel remained motionless in his own bed, listening to that sound that revealed a pain that he was not prepared to understand or console. She realized then that she had never asked herself how she felt about the whole situation, if she had dreams that had been shattered or fears that kept her awake at night. The nagging truth was that Mary was becoming more than just a practical solution to her problems. She was becoming a presence he looked forward to when he returned from work, a soft voice that softened the weight of the silence that had been his only companion for so many months. Samuel didn't know how to deal with these new feelings, so he pushed them into a dark corner of his heart and pretended they didn't exist. Time has the power to transform strangeness into familiarity, and familiarity into something dangerously close to tenderness. Samuel discovered this when he realized that he was waiting for the aroma of the coffee that Mary prepared every morning. It wasn't just the coffee that awaited, but the quiet ritual of her moving through the kitchen, the light footsteps on the wooden floor, the low murmur that accompanied her work. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding, and the house had developed new rhythms that he didn't know he needed. Mary had hands that repaired broken things without making a fuss. He mended his torn shirts during the nights, using thread that he unwound from a small reel that he kept in a crumpled tin box. Samuel would find his clothes folded neatly, the tears sewn with stitches so small they almost disappeared. She never mentioned these little kindnesses, as if they were secrets she shared only with the night. The garden at the back of the house began to show signs of life under her persistent care. Shy green shoots pierced the dry land, defying the inclement sun that punished everything in that region. Samuel watched Mary water the plants with precious water she saved in every possible way, speaking softly to each seedling, as if she could convince them to grow through sheer force of will. One day, when Samuel returned from work in the fields earlier than usual, he found Mary sitting on the porch step, mending a leaky sock with intense concentration. The afternoon sun cast soft shadows on her face, softening the lines of fatigue that marked someone who had known hard work from a very young age. For a moment, he paused to watch her without her noticing how his lips moved silently as he counted the points. It was then that Samuel realized that something had changed within him. The initial contempt had given way to a strange curiosity about who this woman was that her father had sold for 2 chickens. What kind of life had she lived before she got there? What dreams did you carry in your chest that you would never share with him? The realization disturbed him unexpectedly because it meant he was beginning to see her as a real person, not just as a business transaction that had solved some of his practical problems. The nights brought a different intimacy, not physical, but emotional. Samuel began to notice how Mary moved around the house after dinner, organizing things that didn't need to be organized, sweeping corners that were already clean. She seemed to avoid her own room, as if the loneliness of those 4 walls was too heavy to bear. Sometimes he would find her sitting in the dark kitchen, just looking out the window at the nothingness that stretched beyond the property. One of these nights, Samuel broke the silent barrier they had built between them. He sat in the opposite chair of the kitchen table and stood there saying nothing, just sharing the weight of that silence that they both knew well. Mary looked up in surprise, but said nothing. They stayed like this for almost an hour, 2 lonely people who had found a strange form of company. From that night on, the ritual was repeated with increasing frequency. After dinner, they would sit in the kitchen and share the silence as other couples shared conversations. Samuel found that there was comfort in that stillness, a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Mary seemed to relax in these moments, her shoulders losing the constant tension she carried during the day. It was during one of these silent nights that Samuel realized he was in love with his wife. The discovery came like a punch in the stomach, unexpected and devastating. She didn't know when it had happened exactly, whether it had been gradual like the growth of the plants in her garden, or sudden like a summer storm in the desert. He knew only that he looked at Mary and saw no longer a stranger who shared his house, but the woman who had brought life back to a place that was slowly dying. Love didn't come with fanfare or dramatic declarations. It came in the form of worry when she coughed through the night, in the desire to buy new fabric so that she could make a decent dress, in the sudden desire to protect her from anything that might hurt her. Samuel found that he thought about her during the day, imagining her shy smile that appeared rarely, but that lit up his face in a way that made his heart race. Mary also seemed to be changing. Her movements around the house had lost some of her initial rigidity, as if she were starting to feel less like an intruder and more like a person who belonged here. She began to make small improvements to the decor, placing wildflowers in makeshift jars, sewing simple curtains for the windows. Each move transformed Samuel's home into something that looked more like a real home. One morning, Samuel woke up to the unusual sound of Mary singing while making coffee. It wasn't the usual low murmur, but a real song with a clear melody and a soft voice that floated through the house like an unexpected blessing. He remained in bed for a few extra minutes, just listening, realizing that this was the first time she had looked truly happy since she had been there. When she finally got up and entered the kitchen, Mary abruptly stopped singing, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. The blush on her cheeks revealed embarrassment, but also something else. There was light in her eyes that wasn't there before, a spark of life that made Samuel realize that she too was changing. She was also beginning to feel something different for him. That morning they exchanged more glances than words, but each glance carried new weight. Samuel watched Mary watch him as he drank coffee, her eyes following his movements with attention that had nothing to do with domestic obligation. There was interest there, perhaps even nascent affection that she was learning to recognize. The day passed with a different energy between them. Small gestures took on new meaning. Mary serving an extra piece of bread for lunch, Samuel bringing wildflowers he found in the field. They said nothing about these pleasantries, but they both understood that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them. When night came, they sat in the kitchen as usual, but this time the silence was laden with unexplored possibilities. Samuel watched Mary in the dim light of the lamp, memorizing every detail of her face as if it were the most precious thing he had ever seen. She did the same, her eyes meeting his with newfound courage that surprised them both. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Samuel wondered if there was hope that this arranged union could turn into something real and true. Sometimes happiness comes like a thief in the night, silent and unexpected, stealing the heart before the mind realizes what has happened. Samuel woke up one September morning with the strange certainty that his life had found a purpose he didn't know he was looking for. Mary was in the kitchen as usual, but there was something different in the air between them, an almost palpable electricity that made her every move feel like an elaborate dance just for him. When she poured him the coffee, their fingers touched briefly, and the contact sent a stream of heat down his arm that left him breathless. The days that followed brought a quiet revolution in the Turner household. Mary began to smile more often, shy little smiles that appeared when she thought he wasn't looking. Samuel found himself making excuses to go home for the day, pretending that he had forgotten some tool or needed to fetch water, when in fact he just wanted to see it for a few extra minutes. The most notable transformation happened during meals. What were once silent and awkward encounters have become moments of increasing intimacy. They still didn't talk much, but their eyes talked in ways that words couldn't express. Samuel watched Mary eat, fascinated by the delicacy of her movements, by the way she chewed thoughtfully, as if savoring not only the food, but the very experience of sharing that moment with him. One afternoon, while repairing the corral fence, Samuel heard Mary singing again. This time she didn't stop when she realized he was nearby. Her voice floated through the warm afternoon air, carrying a melancholy melody that spoke of loneliness and lost hope. Samuel stopped work and stood still, listening to every note, every whispered word that told stories of pain that he now desperately wanted to heal. When she finished singing, there was a moment of absolute silence, broken only by the dry wind that blew between the loose boards of the house. Mary appeared on the porch, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but without the instinctive fleeing movement that characterized her early days there. They looked at each other across the dusty courtyard, and Samuel saw in those brown eyes a vulnerability that made him want to run across the space that separated them and take her in his arms. But he didn't move. There were still barriers between them, invisible walls built by the strange circumstances that had united them. Samuel knew Mary was beginning to trust him, but he also knew that pressing too fast could destroy the fragile progress they had made. Then he just smiled, a genuine smile that she returned with charming shyness before disappearing again into the house. Nights in the kitchen became the most precious moment of the day for Samuel. They had continued to sit in silence, but now it was a comfortable silence charged with mutual understanding. Samuel began to notice little details about Mary that left him completely bewitched. How nervously she played with a loose thread of her sleeve when she was thinking, how her lips curled slightly when some pleasant memory passed through her mind, how she closed her eyes and inhaled deeply in the aroma of coffee as if it were the most exotic perfume in the world. It was during one of these nights that Samuel found the courage to break the silence in a different way. Instead of words, he reached across the table, offering his open palm as a silent invitation. Mary stared at his hand for long seconds, her eyes revealing an internal battle between fear and desire. Finally, with hesitant movement, she placed her small, calloused hand over his. The ringtone was electric. Samuel felt every callus on his palms, every little scar that told stories of hard work and survival. But he also felt the surprising softness of his fingers, the delicacy of his movements, as she shyly explored the texture of his skin. They stayed like this for minutes that seemed like hours, hands clasped on the worn wooden table, two hearts learning to trust each other. Mary was the first to walk away, but she did so with visible reluctance. His eyes shone with an emotion that Samuel could not fully decipher, but which seemed a mixture of joy and terror. She muttered goodnight hoarsely and disappeared into her room, leaving Samuel alone with the lingering warmth of her hand still burning in his palm. That night, Samuel lay awake for hours, reliving that simple moment that had meant everything. For the first time since Mary had arrived, he allowed himself to imagine a real future with her. Not just coexistence, but true partnership, maybe even mutual love, if he was brave enough to believe that she could develop genuine feelings for him. The following days brought subtle but significant changes. Mary began to spend more time in the main room during the nights, mending clothes or working on small sewing projects, while Samuel read one of the few books he had by lamplight. Sometimes she would look up from work and watch him read, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Samuel found that he liked to be watched by her. There was something comforting about Mary's quiet attention, as if she was studying every aspect of it and coming to favorable conclusions. He began to groom himself more carefully in the morning, making sure his clothes were clean and his hair combed, even though he knew he would spend the day working in the blazing sun. One morning, Samuel woke up earlier than usual and found Mary already in the kitchen, but not making coffee as usual. She was standing in front of the small window, staring at the horizon, with a strange expression he couldn't interpret. There was tension in her shoulders, a stiffness she hadn't seen in weeks, as if some disturbing thought had visited her dreams. When she noticed his presence, Mary turned quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. During breakfast, she seemed distracted, her movements less fluid than usual, as if part of her mind was somewhere else entirely. Samuel tried to get her attention with small kind gestures, but she responded automatically, as if she was only physically present. That day passed with Mary quieter than usual. She carried out her household chores as efficiently as ever, but without the quiet contentment that Samuel had learned to associate with her movements around the house. Several times he surprised her by looking out the window with that same distant and worried expression of the morning. During dinner, the tension was almost palpable. Mary barely touched the food, pushing the pieces across the plate without actually eating. When Samuel tried to catch her gaze, she would turn away quickly, as if there was something she didn't want him to see. The silence between them was no longer comfortable, but laden with unexpressed anxiety that made Samuel wonder if he had done anything to disturb her. That night, Mary did not come to the kitchen as had become customary. Samuel waited for more than an hour, listening to the sounds of the house settling into the night, but she remained in her room. He could hear occasional movements through the thin wall, as if she were packing things, or perhaps packing belongings. The thought struck him like lightning. Mary was planning to leave. Samuel stood motionless in the kitchen chair, processing this terrible possibility that he had not considered before. Why would she leave now, just when it seemed like they were building something real between them? Had you misinterpreted the signs? The shy touches, the smiles, the moments of quiet intimacy? Had all this been just his desperate imagination? But even as these doubts tortured him, Samuel knew in his heart that Mary's feelings were genuine. Something else was going on, something she couldn't or didn't want to share with him. Something that was forcing her to consider leaving the one place where she had found a shadow of happiness. There are losses that destroy a man from within, and there are losses that rebuild him with iron and fire in the blood. Samuel woke up to the first ray of sunlight coming through the bedroom window, but something was wrong. The house was too quiet, without the familiar sound of Mary's light footsteps in the kitchen, without the aroma of the coffee she religiously brewed every morning. A strange chill ran down his spine as he got out of bed, already knowing deep in his heart that his life had changed forever during the night. Mary's room was empty. Not only empty of her presence, but empty of her belongings, as if she had never existed in that house. The bed was made to military perfection. The few clothes she owned were gone, and even the small spool of thread she used to mend her clothes was no longer on the makeshift table that served as a dressing table. Only the soft smell of homemade soap remained in the air, the last vestige of his passage through that space. Samuel went through the house like a possessed man, looking for some clue, some sign that would explain the impossible disappearance of his wife. The chickens that had sealed their fate scratched normally in the yard, oblivious to the fact that the woman who fed them with so much affection had vanished like smoke in the desert wind. There were no footprints on the hard earth around the house, no marks of struggle or sign that she had voluntarily left. The most devastating discovery came when Samuel found, hidden under her mattress, a small rag doll made of scraps of fabric. It was rough, clearly sewn by inexperienced hands, but it carried a love so palpable that it made her eyes burn. Mary had worked on it during the nights, probably while he slept, creating something beautiful out of nothing, as only she knew how to do. The fact that she had left behind that doll that obviously meant something special confirmed that her departure had not been voluntary. Samuel mounted his horse before the sun had even fully risen and began to make his way through the region, visiting every farm, every settlement, every place where anyone could have seen anything. The neighbors greeted him with the mixture of sympathy and discomfort they reserved for men who had lost something important. No one had seen Mary. No one had heard anything unusual during the night. No one had answers to the questions that burned like a red-hot iron in Samuel's chest. It was in the city, 3 days after he began his desperate search, that Samuel found the first royal clue. The tavern owner, a fat man named Morrison who heard more conversations than he should, casually mentioned that he had seen 3 strange men in town 2 days before Mary's disappearance. Trouble-looking outsiders, I had said, the kind that appears and disappears without a trace, but always leaves destruction in its path. One, Morrison recalled with increasing clarity under the pressure of Samuel's intense gaze, had asked specifically about newlywed farmers in the area. He had asked the question too casually, as if he didn't want to sound interested, but Morrison had decades of experience reading men's intentions through his eyes. There was wickedness in those 3, a hunger that had nothing to do with food or drink. Samuel felt the blood run cold in his veins when he realized that Mary had not run away. She had been taken away, torn from her bed as he slept a few feet away, unable to protect the woman who had learned to love more than life itself. Guilt hit him like an avalanche, overwhelming and relentless. How could a man who claimed to be able to care for a wife fail so completely at the only thing that mattered? The search became an obsession that consumed every waking moment of Samuel. He abandoned the farm, sold everything that could be sold, and used the money to hire trackers, pay informants, follow any clue that might lead him to Mary. The men he consulted shook their heads with barely concealed pessimism. Women who disappeared into the hands of outsiders were rarely found alive, and when they were, they usually preferred to be dead. But Samuel refused to accept this possibility. He had seen the quiet strength Mary carried within her, the iron resolve hidden beneath her frail appearance. She had survived a father who had sold her like cattle. She had flourished in a house where she was initially not wanted. She had found ways to create beauty and hope where there was only despair. Mary was not the kind of woman who gave herself without a fight. Weeks turned into months, and the cold trail of the kidnappers seemed to dissipate like a mirage on the horizon. Samuel had traveled hundreds of miles, visited cities he didn't even know existed, talked to people who lived on the margins of law and society. His appearance changed during those months of tireless searching. The thin, defeated man who had married 2 chickens disappeared, replaced by someone hardened by purpose, sculpted by the unwavering determination to reclaim what had been stolen from him. The ultimate lead came via a drunken cowboy in a dirty frontier town called Redemption. The man, tongue loose from cheap whiskey, mentioned seeing a woman matching Mary's description on a secluded estate 3 days' ride west. She was alive, he said, but obviously held against her will by men who didn't care for subtlety or discretion. Samuel left before dawn, taking only the essentials: his gun, enough ammunition for a small war, and the determination burning like burning coal in his chest. It had no elaborate plans or complex strategies. He was only absolutely sure that he would bring Mary back home, or die trying. The property that the cowboy had described was a place forgotten by God and men, a set of deteriorated buildings surrounded by barren land that stretched to the horizon. Samuel observed the place from afar for hours, counting men, memorizing routines, looking for the best time to act. There were 4 in total, including the 3 Morrison had described in the tavern. When darkness finally covered the desert like a black cloak, Samuel moved with the patience of a predator who had waited months for that moment. There was no room in his heart for doubt or hesitation. There was only Mary, somewhere on that accursed property, waiting for him. The first man died without making a sound, Samuel's blade finding his neck before he could scream. The second managed to draw his gun, but couldn't aim it before a bullet went through his heart. The third tried to flee, and was knocked into the dusty courtyard, his blood mixing with the dry earth that had witnessed far too much violence. The leader, A tall man with a scar on his face that Samuel recognized from Morrison's description was waiting for him in the main house. There was acceptance in his eyes as Samuel walked through the front door, as if he knew that moment would come eventually. The fight was brief and brutal, ending with Samuel standing over the body of the man who had stolen his happiness. Samuel found Mary in a small building at the back of the property, chained but alive, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and disbelief when he appeared at the door. She was thinner, scarred by months of captivity, but the indomitable spirit he had grown to love still burned brightly in her brown eyes. They didn't exchange words during the long journey home. Mary rode beside him in silence, occasionally touching his arm as if she needed to make sure he was real. Samuel understood that silence. Some experiences were too great to be contained in words, some joys too deep to be expressed through speech. When they finally arrived at the farm, Samuel helped Mary disassemble and led her to the house she had made a real home. She stopped at the kitchen door, looking around as if she was seeing the place for the first time, silent tears running down her thin cheeks. That night, for the first time since they met, Mary didn't sleep in her small room at the back of the house. She slept in the arms of Samuel, two survivors who had found in each other the only thing in the world worth fighting to protect. The marriage that had begun as a sordid transaction by two chickens had grown into something that transcended ordinary love, forged in the fire of loss and tempered with the iron of absolute determination. Samuel Turner had learned that some treasures reveal their true value only when they threaten to disappear forever, and that true love is not measured by the ease with which it is conquered, but by the ferocity with which it is defended. If this journey of love forged in adversity has touched your soul, you can't miss the next stories we have in store about the American Wild West, where men and women discover that true strength comes not from violence, but from the courage to protect those we love. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives about redemption, survival, and the transformative power of true love, and leave your comment below telling us what was the moment that most moved his heart in this saga of Samuel and Mary. It was his silent despair when he discovered her disappearance, the relentless search through the desert, or the reunion that proved that some bonds are too strong to be broken by any force in this world.